Judge Patricia Williams slammed her gavel and sneered at the bearded defendant. "Remove that terrorist head wrap in my courtroom, or face contempt charges." She had no idea that the dangerous extremist she was humiliating was actually the federal prosecutor who'd been building a corruption case against her for 6 months. If you want to witness how one judge's racist outburst became the most expensive 30 seconds in judicial history, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell, because what happens next will restore your faith in justice. But let's go back to where it all began. The Honorable Patricia Williams adjusted her black robes and surveyed courtroom 4B with the smug satisfaction of someone who'd controlled her domain for 15 years. Federal District Court for the Southern District of New York was her kingdom, and she ruled it with an iron fist wrapped in judicial immunity. This morning's docket was typical: drug possession, fraud cases, immigration violations. The kind of defendants who couldn't afford lawyers who actually fought back. Bailiff Tom Rodriguez called the court to order as the morning's first case was brought in. The People versus Hassan Al-Mahmoud, case number 2025, CR 4456. The defendant entered through the side door, flanked by 2 marshals. Tall, bearded, wearing a traditional white kufi on his head and a simple gray suit that looked like it came from a department store clearance rack. Judge Williams felt her jaw tighten immediately. Muslim defendant. Traditional Islamic headwear. Probably another terrorism-related charge or immigration fraud. She'd seen hundreds of these cases over the years, and they all looked the same to her: foreign threats disguised as American residents. "State your name for the record," Williams commanded without looking up from her papers. The defendant stepped forward, his posture confident despite being in shackles. "Hassan Al-Mahmoud, Your Honor." His voice carried no accent, no hint of foreign birth. Pure American English, educated, professional. Williams finally looked up, her eyes immediately focusing on the kufi with undisguised disgust. 15 years on the bench had taught her that Islamic headwear meant trouble. Terrorists, extremists, people who refused to assimilate into American culture. She'd made it her personal mission to teach these defendants about American values. "Mr. Al-Mahmoud," Williams' voice dripped with contempt, "we have rules in American courtrooms. Rules about respect, decorum, and appropriate dress." The defendant remained silent, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Most defendants looked down, showed fear, begged for mercy. This one was watching her like he was taking notes. Court reporter Sandra Mitchell's fingers flew across her stenotype machine, capturing every word of what was about to become the most expensive judicial misconduct case in federal court history. In the gallery, 2 men in expensive suits sat quietly in the back row, one of them live streaming the proceedings on his phone. "Your Honor," Public Defender Maria Santos stood up, "my client is dressed appropriately according to federal court guidelines. Religious headwear is permitted under." Williams cut her off with a wave of her hand. "Counselor, I'll determine what's appropriate in my courtroom." She turned back to Hassan, her voice rising to ensure everyone could hear. "Mr. Al-Mahmoud, remove that terrorist head wrap immediately, or I'll hold you in contempt of court." The words echoed off the mahogany walls like gunshots. Several people in the gallery started recording on their phones. Hassan remained perfectly still, his hands folded despite the shackles. "Your Honor, this is a kufi. It's traditional Islamic headwear, no different from a yarmulke or a turban. Federal law protects religious expression in court proceedings." His calm, educated response only fueled Williams' anger. "Don't quote law to me." Williams slammed her gavel so hard it cracked. "I've been on this bench for 15 years. I know Islamic extremism when I see it." The courtroom fell silent except for the soft clicking of phone cameras recording every moment. Hassan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. The patient defendant was transforming into something else entirely. "Your Honor, are you stating on the record that Islamic religious practices constitute extremism?" Williams felt a flush of anger at being questioned by a defendant. "I'm stating that you will remove that headwear right now, or I'll add contempt charges to whatever terrorism-related offenses you're here for." She pulled up his case file on her computer screen, expecting to see the usual litany of national security charges. But the screen showed something that made her blood run cold. Case number 2025, CR 4456. The People versus Hassan al-Mahmoud. Charges: public intoxication, disorderly conduct. Minor misdemeanor charges that typically resulted in time served or small fines. Nothing even remotely terrorism-related. Public Defender Santos stood again, her voice shaking with barely controlled outrage. Your Honor, my client was arrested for being drunk in public. These are misdemeanor charges that typically result in a $50 fine. Williams stared at the screen, her prejudiced assumptions crashing against reality. Hassan took a step forward, still in shackles, but somehow commanding the courtroom's attention. Your Honor, before you continue, I have one question. His voice carried a quality that made everyone lean forward to listen. Are you familiar with the judicial conduct implications of religious discrimination from the bench? The question hit Williams like a physical blow. Federal judges couldn't be sued, but they could be investigated, censured, even impeached for constitutional violations. What are you implying? She snapped, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. Hassan's phone, which had been confiscated during booking, suddenly rang from the evidence table. The ringtone was professional, urgent. Bailiff Rodriguez looked to Williams for instruction. Answer it, Hassan said quietly. It's probably the Department of Justice wondering why their lead prosecutor hasn't reported in this morning. The words hit the courtroom like lightning. Department of Justice. Lead prosecutor. Williams felt her career prospects shifting beneath her feet like quicksand. That's impossible, she whispered. You're a defendant. You're in shackles. Hassan smiled for the first time since entering her courtroom. Your Honor, I'm Hassan al-Mahmoud, Senior Federal Prosecutor, Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. And for the past 6 months, I've been investigating complaints about racial and religious bias in your courtroom. The phone continued ringing as Williams stared at the man she'd just called a terrorist. Her 15-year career was about to become a footnote in civil rights history. Rodriguez answered the phone, his face going pale as he listened. Your Honor, he said quietly, it's Attorney General Johnson. She's asking to speak with Prosecutor al-Mahmoud immediately. Williams' gavel slipped from her numb fingers and clattered to the floor. Attorney General Sarah Johnson's voice crackled through the courtroom speaker like divine judgment. Hassan, are you there? We've been monitoring the live stream. Federal marshals are en route. Williams felt her world collapse as she realized thousands of people were watching her career implode in real time. Hassan remained perfectly calm despite the shackles binding his wrists. Sarah, I'm here. Judge Williams just provided us with enough evidence to support every discrimination complaint we've received. He looked directly at Williams, who had gone pale as courthouse marble. 6 months of investigation, and she just confessed everything on the record. Court reporter Sandra Mitchell's hands trembled as she transcribed the most explosive judicial misconduct case of her career. Every word was being preserved for federal investigators, civil rights lawyers, and the media circus that would inevitably follow. Williams found her voice, though it came out as a hoarse whisper. This is entrapment. You can't pose as a defendant to gather evidence. But even as she spoke, she knew how desperate she sounded. Federal prosecutors didn't need warrants to witness public discrimination. Your Honor, Hassan replied with devastating calm, I was arrested legitimately last night for public intoxication after a colleague's retirement party. The booking officer, unaware of my identity, processed me as John Doe until identification could be verified. This morning's proceedings were entirely authentic. Public Defender Maria Santos stared at her client with dawning horror and admiration. You're really Department of Justice? Hassan nodded. Civil Rights Division. And Maria, you just witnessed a federal judge violate my constitutional rights on camera. The 2 men in expensive suits rose from the gallery's back row. Judge Williams, the taller one, called out, Agent Michael Torres, FBI Internal Affairs. Agent Lisa Chun, we're here to escort you for questioning regarding multiple civil rights violations. Williams gripped her bench with white knuckles. You can't arrest a sitting federal judge. But her voice lacked conviction. Judicial immunity protected judges from lawsuits, not criminal prosecution for civil rights violations. Agent Torres approached the bench with handcuffs visible on his belt. Actually, Your Honor, we can. The moment you ordered Prosecutor al-Mahmoud to remove his religious headwear while calling it terrorist attire, you committed a federal crime under Section 242 of Title 18. The live-stream viewer count exploded past 50,000 as news of the sting operation spread across social media. Hashtag Judge Exposed was trending nationally, with legal experts analyzing Williams' violations in real time. Law schools would study this case for decades. Hassan turned to address the packed courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed today is why the Department of Justice investigates discrimination complaints. Judge Williams has violated the civil rights of over 200 Muslim defendants in the past 3 years. Williams suddenly found her voice again, desperation making her reckless. This is a setup, a terrorist infiltrating our courts. But her words only provided more evidence of the bias that had destroyed her career. Agent Chin stepped forward, reading from her tablet. Judge Williams, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in federal court. The Miranda rights echoed through the same courtroom where Williams had denied countless defendants their constitutional protections. Bailiff Rodriguez unlocked Hassan's shackles with hands that shook like autumn leaves. 15 years of watching Williams' discrimination, and he'd finally witnessed her downfall. Sir, he whispered, I'm sorry. I should have spoken up sooner. Hassan rubbed his wrist where the metal had chafed. Tom, you were following orders. But now you know what those orders really meant. He adjusted his kufi with quiet dignity, the same religious headwear that had triggered Williams' spectacular self-destruction. The courtroom doors burst open as federal marshals entered, followed by news crews that had been monitoring the live stream. Williams watched her career evaporate in real time as cameras captured her being led away in handcuffs. Prosecutor Al-Mahmoud, CNN's legal correspondent, called out, How long have you been investigating Judge Williams? Hassan straightened his tie, transforming from defendant back into the federal prosecutor who just executed the most elaborate sting operation in judicial history. 6 months, he replied, his voice carrying the authority that Williams had tried so hard to suppress. We received over 200 discrimination complaints. Judge Williams just validated every single one of them. Agent Torres secured Williams' hands behind her back as she continued protesting her innocence. This is America. We don't bow to Islamic law. Even while being arrested, she couldn't stop providing evidence of her bias. Hassan's phone buzzed with a text from the Attorney General. Exceptional work. Press conference at 2 p.m. He looked around the courtroom where his faith had been mocked, his heritage weaponized, his dignity attacked. Justice had been served at the temperature of ice-cold revenge. Your Honor, Hassan called out as Williams was led away, I'll see you in federal court. This time, I'll be wearing the prosecutor's suit I earned, and you'll be wearing the defendant's orange jumpsuit you've earned. The live stream hit 100,000 viewers as Williams disappeared through the same door she'd watched thousands of defendants exit over 15 years of biased rulings. Hassan's real trial was just beginning. The federal courthouse steps erupted into chaos as news vans surrounded Hassan al-Mahmoud. Microphones thrust toward the man who just executed the most audacious judicial sting operation in American history. Still wearing the gray defendant's suit that had fooled Judge Williams, Hassan commanded the media scrum with the quiet authority of someone who just changed legal precedent forever. Prosecutor Al-Mahmoud, shouted ABC's legal correspondent, how does it feel to have your civil rights violated by the very system you swore to protect? Hassan adjusted his kufi, the same religious headwear that had triggered Williams' downfall, and faced the cameras with unwavering composure. For 6 months, my team documented systemic discrimination in Judge Williams' courtroom. Hassan began, his voice carrying across the crowd of reporters, protesters, and federal agents. Muslim defendants received sentences averaging 300% harsher than non-Muslim defendants for identical crimes. Today, she provided the smoking gun we needed. Inside the courthouse, Judge Patricia Williams sat in a holding cell designed for the very defendants she'd spent 15 years oppressing. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on her frame as she stared at concrete walls covered in scratch prayers and phone numbers. Her judicial immunity had evaporated the moment she'd crossed from bias into criminal behavior. FBI agent Lisa Chun entered the holding area with a thick folder. Judge Williams, we need to discuss the 247 cases we're reviewing for judicial misconduct. Williams looked up, her eyes red from crying. Those were legitimate sentences based on criminal history and severity. Really? Chin opened the folder, revealing page after page of statistical analysis. Ahmed Rashid got 6 months for marijuana possession. Timothy Johnson, same charge, same priors, same week, got probation. The only difference was Rashid's religion. Williams tried to speak, but the numbers were damning. Back outside, Hassan's press conference had drawn a crowd of hundreds. Civil rights activists held signs reading "Justice for Hassan" and "End Judicial Islamophobia." Counter-protesters shouted about judicial independence and activist prosecutors, but their voices were drowned out by the overwhelming support. This wasn't about revenge, Hassan continued, fielding questions from the growing media circus. This was about accountability. Every time Judge Williams called my faith terrorism, she violated her oath to provide equal justice under law. His phone buzzed constantly with interview requests from 60 Minutes, CNN, Fox News, and legal podcasts. Department of Justice vehicles lined the courthouse perimeter as federal investigators seized Williams' computer files, case records, and correspondence. The scope of the investigation was expanding beyond individual bias into potential criminal conspiracy. How many other judges shared Williams' prejudices? How many Muslim defendants have been denied fair trials? Attorney General Sarah Johnson stepped to the podium, her presence instantly quieting the crowd. Today's events represent both a failure and a triumph of our justice system. A failure that such discrimination existed. A triumph that our investigators exposed it. She gestured toward Hassan with obvious pride. Prosecutor Al Mahmoud's courage made this possible. Williams' attorney, David Mitchell, arrived at the courthouse to find his client already processed and facing federal charges. 23 years of defending judicial misconduct cases, and he'd never seen evidence this clear-cut. "Patricia," he said through the holding cell bars, "they have you on video calling Islamic prayer terrorism. This is unwinnable." Hassan's phone rang with a call from his wife, Fatima. "Habibi, are you safe? I'm watching the news." Her voice carried the worry of someone who'd watched her husband face discrimination for years. "I'm fine," Hassan replied softly. "Today, we made sure no other Muslim family has to experience what we've experienced." The live stream from the morning's court session had reached 500,000 views, with clips going viral across TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram. Law students were analyzing the footage frame by frame. Civil rights organizations were preparing amicus briefs. The case was becoming a watershed moment for judicial accountability. Agent Torres emerged from the courthouse with additional arrest warrants. "We've identified 3 other judges with similar discrimination patterns," he announced to the press. "This investigation is expanding." Williams' case had opened a door that couldn't be closed. Hassan looked at his watch, a gift from his father when he'd graduated law school. "Son," the older man had said in Arabic, "time is the most honest judge." Today, time had finally caught up with Judge Patricia Williams. Her 15 years of bias had been condensed into 30 seconds of career-ending discrimination. As the sun set over Manhattan, Hassan prepared for the hardest part of his mission. Tomorrow, he would face Williams in the same courtroom where she'd humiliated him. But this time, he'd be wearing the prosecutor's suit he'd earned, and she'd be wearing the defendant's handcuffs she'd earned. The reversal would be complete, but the real work of healing America's broken justice system was just beginning. Williams sat in her cell, finally understanding what every Muslim defendant in her courtroom had felt: powerless, prejudged, and completely at the mercy of a system that had already decided their fate. Justice, Hassan reflected, was indeed blind. But today, she finally opened her eyes. Federal courtroom 4B had been transformed overnight. The same mahogany walls that had witnessed Judge Patricia Williams' discriminatory rampage now hosted her own trial for civil rights violations. Hassan al-Mahmoud stood at the prosecutor's table, his tailored navy suit and crisp white shirt a stark contrast to the defendant's gray outfit he'd worn just 48 hours earlier. Williams sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, her hands shackled to a chain around her waist. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the packed courtroom. The same restraints she'd watched thousands of Muslim defendants were now cutting into her own wrists. Her attorney, David Mitchell, shuffled papers nervously, knowing this case was unwinnable. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Robert Chun," the bailiff announced. Judge Chun, a soft-spoken Asian-American jurist known for his fairness, took the bench with the gravity befitting such a historic case. the first federal judge prosecuted for religious discrimination in over 50 years. Hassan opened his case file, the same methodical preparation he'd used to build cases against terrorists and corrupt politicians. But this felt different. Personal. Every statistic in that folder represented a Muslim family whose lives had been derailed by Williams' prejudice. Your Honor, the evidence will show systematic, intentional discrimination based solely on religious identity. Williams supporters filled half the gallery, mostly older white courthouse employees who believed judicial independence was under attack. The other half overflowed with civil rights activists, Muslim families who'd been victimized by Williams' bias, and law students documenting legal history in real time. The defendant, Patricia Williams, Hassan began, his voice carrying the authority Williams had tried to strip from him, violated the civil rights of 247 Muslim defendants over 3 years. She imposed sentences averaging 300% harsher than identical cases involving non-Muslim defendants. David Mitchell objected immediately. Your Honor, prosecutorial vindictiveness. Mr. Al-Mahmoud has a personal vendetta against my client. But Judge Chun overruled with a gentle shake of his head. The prosecutor was investigating these complaints long before his own arrest. Personal experience doesn't disqualify him from seeking justice. Hassan clicked a remote, and the courtroom screens filled with statistical analysis that made Williams' bias undeniable. Ahmed Rashid, marijuana possession, first offense, 6 months county jail. Timothy Johnson, same charge, same week, same background, probation. The only variable was religion. Williams whispered frantically to her attorney, but Mitchell looked defeated. The evidence was overwhelming, documented by Hassan's 6-month investigation and confirmed by her own recorded statements. She called Islamic prayer terrorism. Hassan continued. She ordered me to remove my kufi, calling it a terrorist hijab. These aren't isolated incidents. They're a pattern of constitutional violations. Fatima Al-Mahmoud sat in the front row, her hijab worn proudly despite the hostile stares from Williams supporters. She'd watched her husband face discrimination for years, and today felt like vindication for every moment of prejudice their family had endured. Hassan called his first witness, Dr. Maria Santos, a statistician who'd analyzed 3 years of Williams' sentencing data. The probability of such disparities occurring by chance, Santos testified, is less than 1 in 10 million. This represents clear, systematic bias. Williams' face crumpled as the numbers painted an undeniable picture of her prejudice. Every harsh sentence, every contempt charge, every moment of bias had been recorded in court transcripts that now condemned her. Her 15-year career was being dissected like a criminal conspiracy. Mitchell's cross-examination was half-hearted. How do you defend the indefensible? How do you explain away recorded statements calling Islamic faith terrorism? Dr. Santos, he asked weakly, couldn't these disparities reflect legitimate judicial discretion? Not when the disparities align perfectly with religious identity, Santos replied. Judge Williams' sentencing showed no bias regarding race, gender, or economic status. Only religion. Only Islam. The courtroom fell silent as the implications sank in. Hassan's phone buzzed with a text from Attorney General Johnson. Exceptional work. This case will change federal judicial oversight forever. But Hassan wasn't thinking about career advancement. He was thinking about every Muslim defendant who'd stood where Williams now sat, facing a system rigged against their faith. Your Honor, Hassan addressed Judge Chun, we call our next witness, Imam Rashid Hassan, who counseled 16 families whose loved ones received discriminatory sentences in Judge Williams' courtroom. The elderly imam approached the witness, stand with the dignity Williams had tried to strip from every Muslim defendant. As Imam Hassan began his testimony about families destroyed by Williams' bias, the former judge finally understood what she'd really done. These weren't statistics or case numbers. They were human beings whose lives she'd shattered with her prejudice. Hassan looked at Williams, seeing not the powerful judge who'd humiliated him, but a broken woman facing the consequences of 15 years of constitutional violations. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. The trial that would redefine judicial oversight was just reaching its peak. Judge Robert Chun returned to the bench after 3 hours of deliberation, his expression grave as he faced the packed courtroom. Hassan Al-Mahmoud stood at the prosecutor's table, his prayer beads visible in his jacket pocket. The same beads that had once made Williams uncomfortable were now symbols of his triumph over judicial prejudice. The court finds Patricia Williams guilty on all counts, Chen announced, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. Violation of civil rights under color of law, deprivation of constitutional rights, and conspiracy against civil rights. The evidence of systematic religious discrimination is overwhelming and undeniable. Williams collapsed in her chair, the weight of federal conviction crushing her like an avalanche. 15 years of judicial power evaporated in a single sentence. Her supporters in the gallery wept openly, while the Muslim families she'd victimized embraced each other with tears of vindication. Hassan felt no joy in her destruction, only satisfaction that justice had finally been served. He thought of his father's words from decades ago. Son, Allah's justice may be delayed, but it is never denied. Today, those words felt prophetic. The sentence, Judge Chun continued, is 5 years federal prison, followed by 5 years supervised release. Additionally, the defendant will pay $2.3 million in restitution to the 247 families whose rights she violated. Williams' face went white as her financial future joined her judicial career in ruins. Attorney General Sarah Johnson approached the microphone outside the courthouse, flanked by Hassan and civil rights leaders from across the nation. Today's conviction sends a clear message. No judge, regardless of tenure or position, is above the Constitution they swore to protect. Hassan stepped forward, adjusting his kufi with quiet pride. This case was never about revenge against Judge Williams. It was about ensuring that no Muslim family would ever again face systematic discrimination in American courts. His voice carried across the crowd of reporters and activists who'd followed the trial for weeks. CNN's legal analyst called it the most significant judicial accountability case since Watergate. Law schools were already incorporating the Williams case into constitutional law curricula. The precedent would protect religious minorities for generations. Inside the courthouse, Williams was processed for transfer to federal prison. The same booking procedures she'd watched thousands of Muslim defendants endure were now applied to her own trembling hands. Fingerprints, mugshots, strip searches, the complete dehumanization of American criminal justice. Hassan's phone buzzed with hundreds of interview requests, book deals, and speaking engagements. But his first call was to his wife Fatima. It's over, Habibi. She'll never hurt another Muslim family. Fatima's tears of relief came through the phone like a cleansing rain. 6 months later, Hassan received a handwritten letter from federal prison. Williams' shaky handwriting filled 3 pages with apologies, confessions, and pleas for forgiveness. I understand now what I put all those families through, she wrote. The isolation, the fear, the knowledge that the system is rigged against you. I'm sorry. Hassan read the letter twice, then filed it away. Apologies couldn't undo 3 years of systematic discrimination, but they were a beginning. Williams would serve every day of her sentence, while the Muslim families she'd victimized continued rebuilding their shattered lives. The Williams Protocol became mandatory training for every federal judge in America. Hassan's sting operation was studied at the FBI Academy as a masterclass in civil rights enforcement. The case files filled an entire archive, documenting how one woman's prejudice had infected an entire judicial system. Hassan returned to his office at the Department of Justice, where a photo now hung beside his law degree, not of his courtroom victory, but of himself in defendant's shackles, kufi intact, dignity unbroken. The image reminded him that justice delayed wasn't justice denied, just justice perfectly timed. Judge Patricia Williams would spend 5 years learning what every Muslim defendant in her courtroom had known from the moment they entered, that American justice could be cold, brutal, and completely indifferent to your pain. But sometimes, just sometimes, it could also be perfectly, beautifully fair. Hassan knelt on his prayer rug that evening, facing Mecca as he'd done every day for 30 years. His prayers included gratitude for justice served, hope for systemic change, and forgiveness for those who'd learned too late that prejudice always carries a price. The revolution was complete. The healing could finally begin. What discrimination have you witnessed? Share your stories below. Subscribe if you believe justice isn't negotiable. The next Hassan al-Mahmoud is waiting for their moment. Will you be ready to stand up?